Well, what's going to be?
Hello, Rachel.
Better enough for the day. So, yeah, so it's going to be lunchtime to 11. Sometimes, yeah. Yeah. So,
I'm sorry I haven't introduced
I'm sorry.
Pre-med at poetry things I think on Zoom.
yeah, so I think officially comes out on the 12th. And we're going to do a workshop.
Oh, we've got time. We've got 6 minutes or something.
6 minutes.
6 whole minutes, yeah. Anything could happen.
Okay, so to fill in the 6 minutes, I'll just do a bit of health and safety stuff. So tēnā koutou katoa, ko Vicky toko ingoa, ko Mahi toka Fielding. So hello everybody, my name is Vicky and I work here at Fielding Library. It's great to see you this morning on this early Sunday morning. Hope you had a good time last night, whatever you got up to. We had a great day yesterday, first day of the festival. So, in the event of an earthquake, drop cover hold and then you'll exit either out this end of the building or that end and just take your leave for reading the self-account or questing. In the event of a fire, the fire alarm will ring and we have to evacuate as well and take your leave from us and we will do the same thing. For a toilet, for a comfort stop or pakus are just down here on the left, there's two. So just knock on the door before we go in because sometimes it might be occupied, they're not marking on them or anything. Help yourself, there's tea, coffee, biscuits, water, just to help you graze during the day. You don't have to do it at certain times, so please help yourself. We do have books for sale from the different authors that have been here at the Writers' Festival as well. We'd like to browse those and purchase some of those. Yeah, have a great morning. There's a few authors here that are going to speak later on during the morning. And you're here to listen to Thom. Thom is a very great supporter, thank you very much, of the festival. And he helped judge our short story competition that we had as well. So there's one of the winners is sitting behind you there. So short story head off. So yeah, great to see you all. Have a great morning and enjoy.
Thank you. Okay. So nice to meet you. Congratulations. I didn't really know, who had written with the pieces, so that's great. Well, the stories were very, very short. Do you remember yours by any chance?
Oh, not really off the head.
Okay. Okay. Oh, maybe you could recite it for us, because they're like a sentence or something, right? 50 words.
Yeah.
So yeah. Okay. What was it on again?
Referendum.
So it was a funny piece, wasn't it? It was humorous. Yeah, it's good. Okay, cool. Great. Yeah, so I don't know if anyone else will pop in the next 3 minutes, but it's Sunday morning. It's cold. It's wet. Oh, he's married. Well, I'm sorry. Yes, I'll wait.
Put someone else's coffee.
It's not mine, is it?
No, of course. We must be coming in, so I'll just sit here. We're in the same bubble, yeah, we can sit side by side.
Had you seen this before with the chairs, this arrangement?
Yeah, no, but we came yesterday, it was like this.
It's pretty good.
It's quite good to put coffee on.
It's also quite good to give it a view without someone sitting
Yeah.
So I think we're in the same, we can sit next to each other because we've been hanging out the whole time.
Yeah.
wearing each other's clothes. Just rearrange the furniture.
I wonder if mine might be at the other session, so I can just take this.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry for making a big mess. I'm going to come back.
Okay. That's all right. That's good. I was just thanking people for braving the weather in the early hour. Yeah, that's pretty intense. 9:30 on a Sunday. Yeah. hats off to you. So thanks for coming. I hope it's worth getting up this early and coming out in this weather. Yeah, so I meant to have 90 minutes, I think, but I think that's too long for anybody to speak. I wouldn't want to listen to anybody for 90 minutes, so I won't speak quite 90 minutes. Probably more like not quite an hour, maybe more like 40 minutes. And then I thought we would just have a little conversation, and so you get to all sort of go home early, which is nice. Yeah, so I was just saying we were not going to go over 90 minutes. That's I don't expect anyone. I don't think I have 90 minutes to say on anything.
Oh, I bet you do.
So this session is a bit strange because it's about sort of a novel in progress, which is kind of weird because, as most of you know who are writers, a novel in progress is, you know, ephemeral beast, and it can disappear tomorrow because the novel takes a different route. So, so really, it's really useful for me because I get to run something in progress past you and hear your responses. Not sure why it's so useful for you, but it's really great for me. So thank you for coming. You know, I was just saying to someone just beforehand that even if everyone hates it or asks a bunch of questions that are over here and my writing's over here, that's quite useful for me because I can say, oh wow, I thought it was quite funny and everyone's acting like it's very serious. So I better change tack. So that's really great. So basically, the first part of the session is an answer to the question, where does your novel come from? Because people inevitably ask that. And usually the answer is unsatisfactory because it's so short. You know, somebody says, oh, they give us a little quick answer. This answer is going to be unsatisfactory because it's so long. So that's okay. I'm going to start with I'll start with a short answer to where does the novel in progress come from. The novel in progress has the working title of Inland, which resonates here at this particular place. But it also is a sort of reference to the inland of human psychology because it's very, very internal, as novels often are. It's a kind of novel about consciousness, but also about place. And oftentimes place is figured as consciousness, and consciousness is figured as place. So I found out that was a really useful way of thinking of both, to think of the world in terms of an emotional landscape, just the actual physical world, and vice versa. So I found that metaphor useful. Yeah, so what I'm going to start with is so where does the novel come from? It comes out of a process, where did I say? I liked how I said it here. I can't remember, what did I say? So basically a kind of compost, and the compost is background experience, interest, and research. And so I thought I'd talk about background experience, my interest, and my research, and how then drafting, or as Elspeth, as your wonderful essay said that you sent me, drafting is also can be sort of considered practice-led research. So the idea is that when we practice how to do something, we're actually doing it in a sense and learning about it through the act of practice. So yeah, talk a little bit about that. So where does this novel come from, and why should we care? So obviously novels are born out of our own experience, and out of our own backgrounds, and out of our own memory, and that's definitely the case here. So because of that, unfortunately, and somewhat uncomfortably, I have to tell you a little bit about my background because it comes to bear on what happens in this novel. So this novel, if you look at the name of the session, I think we're going to deviate a little bit. It was something about class and writing. And, you know, as novels do, I gave Rachel that idea, I think 6 months ago, and since then it's kind of, class is still quite central, but it's just not quite as central as it was. Belief has come out to be a little more central. Also, as this year has unfolded, and we've seen different things emerge as important in the news and in our own lives, it's centered a little bit more on the notion of belief, but both class and belief are pretty central to my own background. So briefly, my background is working class. Basically, we always had enough to eat, just to give you some sense of where we were, but we did have the electricity and phone turned off a few times, and my family was from that strange American phenomenon of working class conservatives. So my stepfather, who worked at a factory and was laid off, made redundant by this factory, and then hired back at a lower rate, after, just to give you some idea of what this background was like, after he was hired back at a lower rate of pay, he worked with the managers to make sure that the union didn't get involved in their factory, which is a strange sort of phenomenon, right? Because it was directly harmful to himself. But this is the kind of background that I came from. So no sense of class consciousness whatsoever, no sense of being working class. I didn't really even sort of know these terms. I've never heard those. But the kind of narrative is a narrative that I've heard a lot when I've interviewed some people here in New Zealand, and the same sort of terms seem to apply. And basically, I think kind of the overwhelming sort of notion is that the issue of money is always foremost on your mind, right? There's a narrative of impending financial disaster, and that sort of is something that I found in my own background, talking to other people in the U.S. and talking to other people here too. So that kind of seems to be something that's held in common. And that makes sense. When I started doing research later on, I came up with a lovely quote, which do I not have it here? Let's see if I can find it. This is by Annette Kuhn. It's from 1995. And she says, class is something beneath our clothes, under your skin, in your reflexes, in your psyche, at the very core of your being. So it's not biologically determined, but it's somewhere it's quite deep. It's sort of down there. And that was very much my experience growing up that too. And I had a sense growing up that something didn't really belong with me and my family and the other suburban middle-class people that we used to hang out with. But I didn't get a sense for exactly until I was a little bit older, obviously, what was the issue. And the issue was not having any money. So to tell you a little bit more about that quickly, I went to university in the U.S. We weren't quite poor enough to qualify for grants because you have to really be living close to the bone. So we paid for it all in loans, which even at that time was about $20,000 a year for 4 years while I graduate. So you come out of that, as I did if you continue for a master's and PhD, although some of that was funded, you come out in quite a bit of debt. And so I came out in quite a bit of debt. And again, that's, as I started to do research, I saw that, this is one of the symptoms of being a working class is that you take on debt, usually with the promise of some sort of future. This is all related to the novel, by the way, with the promise of something that comes in the future. So I found out that my life was pretty typical, and my patterns sort of fit what sociologists look at as classic patterns of class and trying to negotiate class. So yeah, that's a real quick sort of snapshot of how class factors into my life, because then it factors into the novel that I'm writing. The other thing, and yeah, just getting right into it here, is religion, which I'm not very comfortable talking about, but I have to because, again, it's really quite even more central to the novel I'm writing, particularly the historical novel, which is set not very far from this spot, actually. Basically, my family was deeply religious. My maternal ancestors came to the U.S. to avoid religious persecution in the late 1770s. They were Mennonites, who sort of an offshoot of the Amish, a separatist community. So separatist that my grandmother was born in 1911. Her first language was not English, it was Pennsylvania Dutch, which was a dialect of German, and that's what this separatist community spoke. So really quite separatist. She was the first person in her whole line to go to school, public school, which was required. She went till she was 8 years old, and then immediately dropped out because that was what you actually had to do. So that's what she did. And so she kind of raised me, so obviously notions about religion and a certain sense of how one handles oneself, I absorbed through osmosis. And then my mom, not to be outdone by my grandmother, joined a charismatic church, several churches. At one of them, we actually had speaking in tongues. So quite charismatic, quite interested in sort of very fundamentalist notions of religion. And again, they come to bear upon the novel because part of the answer to why did you choose to look at this particular narrative in the novel or this particular historical setting or this particular incident comes out of, I think, that background. So a background very steeped in issues about class, economic injustice, and religion. All these things sort of meshed together. So that's enough about me. But enough about my background. I'll talk a little bit about some of my interests. So like most conscious human beings in the world today, I'm interested in climate change. It's not even really an interest, really. It's just kind of a condition of living these days. So particularly that interest has led me to an interest in permaculture, which is quite interesting stuff. I'm just beginning to read a little bit about it. But essentially, here's a definition from the founder of permaculture, Bill Mollison, who's from Australia. In 1978, he said, permaculture is a philosophy of working with, rather than against, nature, of protracted and thoughtful observation, rather than protracted and thoughtless labor, and of looking at plants and animals in all their functions, rather than treating any area as a single system, so sort of looking at integration across different systems. It's also a way, interestingly enough, you start reading about permaculture, of organizing human systems and human people as well. So it's really quite interesting. And so I've been looking at that in terms of climate change. Basically, they come up in the novel, but they might not come up today, but they're relevant. So the sort of three ethical principles of permaculture are care of the earth, care of the people, and return of surplus, either to the earth or to the people. So that's the kind of package of permaculture in a nutshell. So that's an interest that's come up in the novel. A couple more interests, a little more fictional sort of interest is historical fiction. First of all, is an interest of mine. So my first novel is called The Naturalist. It's historical fiction. My second novel is called The Salted Air, which was contemporary fiction set in New Zealand. And then all my published work fiction has been contemporary. So although a lot of people think, oh, he's a historical writer, actually I kind of feel like that's sort of a sub-interest of mine. Really my interest is contemporary fiction, but it turns out my sub-interest is what people think of more often when they think of my writing. So that's okay. But this novel kind of combines, again, pulls together all these sorts of interests. So that's quickly, and another emerging interest of mine, I know I've come to the right place here, is regional history. And again, that's going to factor into the novel that I'm working on now. So I'm looking forward to tomorrow because there's all kinds of events on regional history going on tomorrow. So that's going to be fun. And that I kind of explored in print in an essay that I published as the editor for a collection of essays called Home, where I looked a little bit, just a tiny bit at some regional history and activism. So pulling all this stuff together then, the next step for me is research, which in my writing process, it's almost sort of a crutch. You know, you have to be careful of research because you can do too much of it, and I've been guilty of that. But I think I've learned from that, and so my research now is a bit shorter and sharper, which is a good thing. So it's included some interviews with people here, people who wish to remain anonymous, about class and about their experiences with class. So that's been really interesting in terms of research because it's not bulk research, it's actually talking to people and interviewing people. And I have some people in my life, some of whom are quite close to me, who have been really quite honest. I really appreciate that because I know it's very, very hard to do, particularly when we talk about class, particularly when we're talking about need, when we don't have, to have some person that you know, not a stranger, but some person that you know, suddenly ask you, well, how much do you make a week? Where does that go to? How do you spend it? What's the solution? How might you be helped? What's the best? And so out of those conversations, things have arisen for me, which I didn't know much about. So somebody said to me, oh, well, the solution is universal basic income. Don't know if that's true or not, but I did do some research on that. It's very interesting. The notion that we all sort of would get paid, regardless of any other money that we make, we all get a certain income from the government. It's the same for all of us, which has a lot of advantages because you can't look at anybody and say, they're getting too much, they're taking too much of the benefit because we all kind of get the same. So that's a kind of interesting approach to financial inequality, and that's something that two different people I interviewed mentioned as a solution, which I thought was interesting. These are people I wouldn't have, to be honest. I bring my own biases to these interviews, and I wouldn't have thought these particular people would have notions like that, but they sure did. So they actually, which is not surprising, thought a lot about class because it's on their minds and part of their experience every day. Finally, the last little kind of research I've done is good old-fashioned scholarly research, book research, which is good, and that's where I found that wonderful quote from Annette Kuhn. I also found this notion of the habitus, which refers to those deeply ingrained dispositions, which are the products of socialization, particularly in early life, and which orient individuals at a subconscious level to the world around them. And this term was really useful for me because it gave me a way to articulate something that I understood firsthand, but didn't have a word for, And it gave me a way to think about some of the people that I spoke to as well, because they talked about this, what another philosopher calls the sense for being in the game and playing the game, knowing the rules of the game. So it gave me a sense that class is something that is learned at a very deep level, very unconscious, kind of semi-conscious level. And so some of these terms were quite useful. Sometimes you do book research and you realize, yeah, that's nice, but I can't really use it. It doesn't apply to this particular creative work, or it doesn't teach me anything. It doesn't show me the world anew, but I felt that it did in this case, so that was really good. A lot of metaphors about class as a sort of contagious moral disease that people talk about, which I thought was pretty interesting this year. The sense that people that are working class feel as if middle class people don't want to get involved with them because somehow they'll catch a kind of moral disease or get drawn into some kind of nexus where suddenly their lives will become complicated and they'll be giving people lifts to here and there, which there's some truth to. And so that was interesting to read about that and hear about that in the people that I spoke to, that they were aware that people didn't want to get involved, that it seems like too much trouble. Also in the research and in the people I spoke to, a lot of, this won't be shocking, but a lot of critiques of current systems of benefits and compensations that, in terms of one person I spoke to who makes a tremendously small amount of money and supports a family of 4 has chosen not to take the benefit because they said it was so degrading and so humiliating that they would rather be impoverished. So, which I thought was pretty revealing. So, and that's something that you see in the literature too, both here and in the U.S. where I was reading a lot of it, and in the U.K. A wonderful book. I don't know if you know the theorist Andrew Sayer, but he's an economist, and he has a great book called Why We Can't Afford the Rich, and that was it's about that thick. And basically, it's really useful because he kind of gives a really broad context to class and to wealth, starting sort of with kind of prehistory going up to today, talking about different theories. And this notion that there's a punitive aspect to helping poor people is something that's been with us for a really long time. So that's not a new idea. So that was interesting. As I continued to do the research, somewhat late, I discovered that class is dead, which was problematic for me. But theoretically, since at least the mid '90s, the literature talks about how the term hasn't really been used. It's fallen out of favor. There's lots of reasons for this, rise in different kinds of notions of identity. Here's a couple more that comes up in this book by Rosemary Compton called Class Stratification, which she says changes in the structure of work and employment, basically a movement to a gig economy and shifting jobs overseas. The failure of class analysis to address issues of gender, race, and culture, and increasing the relevance of class politics as a feeling of class consciousness is undermined, which we see, which I of course grew up with, but you see this now all the time, in the sense that we shouldn't have a class war, we should identify in ways that draw us together in terms of our economic disposition. And this is partially conscious, it's undermined, but also I think it's just sort of the way that different discourses have played out, and that we're looking at ourselves in terms of different identities now. Of course, the theoretical death of class doesn't actually impact anyone's experience. People still have income inequality, they still have food insecurity, there still is a growing precariat and a huge, huge gap around the world, as you know, between the have-nots and the haves. And there's also still this issue of, let's find this quote, this sense that, here, this is Tim Jackson, an ecological economist. He talks about kind of the hollowness at the center of capitalist culture, and particularly this sort of consumption capitalism. And he says this, you probably have heard this quote, I think it's a good one though. We're being persuaded to spend money we don't have on things we don't need, to create impressions that won't last on people we don't care about. And so I think that's kind of an interesting critique of the whole situation. So that's still happening even though theoretically class is dead. I think maybe we threw the baby out with the bathwater there a little bit, but so anyway, so I put all this is all the sort of compost. I'm putting all this together. And what was interesting as I did the scholarly research, which is a step that So I think a lot of writers aren't very interested in it, sort of skip. But I always find it quite useful because as I did that, I began to put together this link between class and climate change and permaculture. And I start to see these are all kind of the same issue in a way. So for instance, here is a climate change scientist who says, quote, as long as incomes across the world were capped at $40,000 a person, CO2 in the atmosphere could be stabilized. And they have a theory that why that's true. So there's actually a pretty solid connection between consumption, class, and environmental issues, as many people know. There's some other quotes, but I think you got that. So then I come to my novel. The novel also comes out of research. Although all these things were inside me, I knew that religion is important to my background, class is important to my background. Like every other human being on Earth, I'm thinking about climate change, I'm thinking about permaculture, I'm thinking about all these things. And so I also have an interest in historical fiction, and particularly an interest, as I said, in some emerging regional fiction. So one of the places that I read, going a little out of order, but that's okay, was a regional history book by Peter Lyman, who used to work at Massey and grew up in Palmerston North in this area. I think he now lives in Auckland. But the book was called And There We Found Brethren, published in 1977. And it talks a little bit about the historical spread of Brethren thinking and religion in this Manawatu. Talks about all of New Zealand, but it's really based here. And it's really quite interesting. So a lot to learn there in general, and that really resonated with me because of my own religious background. But the particular thing that really interested me, this was the quote, was there was a guy named Joseph Bridgman Roots who moved a small community to Fielding in 1874, right as the town was starting up here. They erected a meeting room, which was called Glasgow Hall, also called Roots Folly, which is meant because later on they ran out of money and they had this beautiful, elaborate meeting hall. But also supposed to be the first church in Fielding. So I'm not sure that's 100% true. I'm going to continue to do some more research on that, but I think it seems to be. But interestingly enough, this is now Peter Lyman says, quote, the assembly was conducted in a unique manner, just put it mildly. Private property was abolished, and members held everything in common, which I haven't found another Brethren community that has had this belief. So this is quite interesting. So it was an intentional commune, a Brethren intentional commune, essentially. And Joseph Roots had complete control over the day-to-day activities of the commune. There's not much known about him that I've found, so if you know anything about him, please pass it my way. But he seems to be fairly rigid. Someone was kicked out for coming late to prayer one day, which seems a bit rough, particularly since you've given all your property to this. So I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. So I immediately start to think, well, there's going to be some issues with property, and so that's just kind of, if I'm going to write a novel about this, because if you have to give all your worldly possessions over to these people, and then they kick you out, and they started to kick everyone out. What happens then? How does that work? So that was interesting. But the members lived on the Big Clearing, and I'd love to find this, on the Big Clearing, that's all I know, 5 miles from Halcombe. They ran a sawmill, farm, and sash and door factory powered by a steam engine, which was actually probably one of the first in this region, if not the first. So they did quite well financially, at least for a little while, because they built this hall. They also then built a schoolhouse next to the hall in Fielding. They don't exist anymore, to the best of my knowledge. But not much more is known about this group, which I thought was kind of an opportunity. Because I mean, one sort of take on historical fiction is, oh, I'm going to take something like in The Naturalist, a character that we know quite a bit about, or Stephen Buck, and I'm just going to sort of reproduce and reinterpret all these elements of his life. But this was sort of the opposite opportunity in that here's something we know almost nothing about. What can we do with this? So I put that together with all the other sort of compost, and then I thought a little bit about my own experience and interviewing people that I've interviewed here, and a contemporary storyline emerged as well. Very early on, a good friend of mine, who is sort of a pain in the ass, and that's why I love her, she said to me, why do you have 2 different storylines? Why don't you just tell one story or the other, make 2 novels of it? How can you tell the story where part of it set in 1880 and part of it set in 1820. What's going to bring these two things together? Which is a really good question, because obviously that's going to be on the mind of every reader. And so, still answering that question, again, it's something that came out of the compost of things. And the other sort of notion, like I said, mentioned earlier, that I hold as pretty true, is that it's the process of drafting that shows us what we're writing, that I think some of the best parts of novels happen by accident. And so I just kind of have faith that somehow these two stories belong together. I'm not exactly sure how, although I've got little hints and glimmers. I mean, geographically they're connected, but that's not enough. We want to know, I feel like, that these stories must be told together. We can't tell them separately. So how do they speak to each other? What do they say about one another? And one of the interesting things is the one story looks backwards and the other story looks forwards, because we have, of course, we have religious people, we have religious background, we have this brothering community, and people regularly have visions and dreams. So I of course need a character who is a visionary and sees the future and has visions and dreams. And then of course I have other characters who are historians who move backwards. So their gazes meet at some point, and I kind of thought of the two parts of the novel. I don't know what this means yet, but as that sort of Escher painting where the two hands are drawing each other, and I don't know how that's possible. So anyway, that's some sense of the process. So that is the very long answer to the question, where did this novel come from? Because people ask that, and usually you get a very unsatisfactory answer. Anyway, so what I thought I would do is I want to have a whole group discussion and talk a little bit about class and about your notions and your ideas, and I want to actually just kind of empirically draw on your ideas a little bit. But I thought I would read a short extract from each of the different sections real quick. And just look at the time. I think I'm going to just cut it down a little bit, even more than I cut it this morning, but I'm going to cut it again, which is great. Skip that. Okay. Just inside the gate, so this is the historical portion. Just inside the gate of our settlement was the mill pond, a deep hole bordered by a stand of flax, where Brother Clyde sometimes shot the native waterfowl. On the north side of the pond stood our sawmill. The other was bounded by the enclosure where the goats and the milking cows were kept. This enclosure was in turn surrounded by a larger paddock that ran alongside the southern side of the road for a full acre. This larger paddock had another behind it, so that it stretched an acre deep. It was often said that when the worldly passed along the road and saw such a broad expanse of cleared bush, they would know that God had blessed our congregation. The sawmill itself had been built before our congregation purchased the land, and it stood on the edge of the Makino Road, just inside the western gate. It was walled on 3 sides, but open to the mill pond on the 4th. We often gathered in this high and sheltered space for a parting prayer before a journey. The mill's roof was supported on 4 posts, each a trunk of totara that would have taken a team of horses to budge, and it rose to a gable thatched in ropo after the Maori fashion. The mill's floor was raised several feet off the rougher underfloor, where the main saw was stored when not in use. The wall of the mill that faced the road was set with high and mullioned windows, rejects from our workshop, though the defects were not as could be noticed from the road below. These windows faced east, so in the mornings the mill was flooded with shafts of light where the sawdust churned with midges. A door in the opposite wall opened to a yard of sawhorses and the offcuts we used for firewood. Tobacco was not permitted in the settlement, but it was in this yard where the brothers sometimes rolled their cigarettes, this prohibition being one that only the most devout could find. I'll just skip to because these steam mills were amazing. They were absolutely terribly dangerous places. I mean, you could lose a leg or an arm or get your head knocked off. So when the steam was up, our mill was an infernal place for 12 hours at a stretch. Saws spun on their fixed circuits, the gnash of their teeth invisible. Clouds of steam issued from the chimney, sometimes collected into a dense and moist fog that hid our settlement from any who passed along the road. I most admired dear brother Hans when he stood beside the shining vat of the steam boiler. Though he was lame and walked by pulling one leg awkwardly behind him, when he stood by the main switch with the boiler at full steam, I thought anyone could see why he must be head miller. I often watched from the gate while he shouted for all to stand clear, as the mighty winch swung across the mill pond, and a great leviathan of a tree broke the smooth surface on its rose and golden cutting deck. I never tired of watching the branchless colossuses, which you don't get to say a lot, as they breached a cant hook in their mouths, and all the mill's shafts and pistons whistling with the burden. Once the trunk had been so enormous that Brother Hans had evacuated the mill. If the boiler blew, it would spew forth the superheated water hammer, which could puncture iron with the force of a cannonball. We were blessed to have been spared this particular calamity, and yet I cannot say how many times in my youthful ignorance I imagined the hideous ruination it might yield. So there's a little glimpse at my sort of portrayal of that historical community. And I'll give you a quick then portrayal of the contemporary storyline, which is not set in a sawmill because there are no trees left. How could it be? There actually are some. Gail wasn't expecting a storm. For the first time in weeks, no months, she wasn't expecting anything. The holiday had been last minute, but no less welcome for that. Text from her old supervisor, Astrid. Friend of a friend, empty batch, free. It was that final word that decided everything. Cleaning was over for the summer, so she might have gone out there alone, but her daughter, Tracy, rang at the last minute. She wasn't on the schedule at work. First Christmas in 3 years. So now here she was, togs dried out against her skin, last of the day trippers packing it in, while the sky over the Tasman melted down through all the usual stages of twilight. She had an eye on Noah, of course, but not a profoundly conscious eye. There were only a handful of people left in the surf, all kids, and she knew which dark head of hair belonged to her grandson. Gail's phone had no data, same as usual, which meant no news, no connection to the noxious mirror world, no forecast either. Her mind on that evening of the storm wasn't blank, so much as open, a mess through which the current of cognition ran. Afterwards, she would return to this moment and ask herself what exactly had been in her mind when the sky darkened. But there wasn't much in her memory to salvage. She had no recollection of clouds as they swam across the pale blue space, the horizon turning to shadow before the sun even met the water. Her friend Pania, she guessed, she was thinking of Pania, a low-voltage trickle of worry for her old friend that didn't resolve into anything definite. Something was wrong with Pania of late, or if not wrong, certainly not right. She was distracted the way Gail had never seen in 35 years of friendship. But Gail hadn't arrived at any conclusions, or even really held on to the idea of Pania too tightly. Her eyes may have flitted along the beach to the place where Noah was leaping the surf. He found some friends, older kids, and they were looking after him. Tracy hadn't left the batch since that morning, but Gail had been in the water with her grandson. She hated that word. It didn't seem to capture much about her relationship with Noah, and it sure as hell didn't go far in describing her. She'd gone hard out with Noah, legs only just starting to ache from the running, the leaping. But it was a good ache. And feeling this good ache, her eyes may have shifted across the figures of those who remained in the water. Maybe she listened for the sound of Noah's voice. Happy cries from him for change, which must have penetrated to her heart and enhanced the serenity she hadn't even known was taking hold. She wasn't blind. She would have seen the clouds piling up, felt the turn in the air as the wind ran backwards out of the sea and clashed with the spin effects in a dry hush that swept down the coast. It just wasn't registering as it normally would have. What had happened next? An adult appeared near the waterline, someone's mother. Gail noticed the woman cup her mouth and call, but the wind dissolved the sound. The word storm still hadn't come to Gail when she stood, pulling the towel close, and took her first steps toward the sea. She could hear the woman's voice then. She was calling for the kids to come out of the water, and they weren't paying her any mind. She first returned from awareness when she noticed the smudge that now obscured the sun. The narrow space between the cloud head and the dazzling black of the sea was stained gray. Rain, of course, lashing rain. She watched it speed across the water until she could hear it hammering the surf like pebbles on a metal roof. So that's the contemporary story. Great. So we're meant to go to what time? 9:32, 11. We won't get there because it's 10. That's okay. But I thought what we might do is just have a little talk about this process, your process, my process, class, fiction. This is the part that's that is described in the pamphlet for the festival. So just have a little chat about things that are on your mind, ask questions, bring up what you like, and yeah, just conversation. Yes?
Tom, you mentioned that class is very deeply ingrained, and I'm misquoting something along the lines of socialism never took root in America because poor people see themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. I was wondering in your view what it would take for something like Bernie Sanders' democratic socialism to actually make some inroads, or hasn't made inroads. Is it actually?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm not a political scientist, so I can just give my own sort of one citizen's person's opinion. But I think it's definitely made inroads. I mean, if you look at the popularity, if you look at the won some primaries, if you look at the way that it's changed the whole discourse in the Democratic, if you're a Democrat, you can't. They were sort of drifting so far to the right, it was hard to tell where they met the Republicans, and I think they've been pulled back now. I think there's a sense of actually, we do have some core constituencies. Remember we used to be sided with labor unions, and we used to care about this. So I think there's sort of a kind of coming back to that, like, oh yeah, it seems like maybe we are a little bit to the left after all. We forgot. So I think that he's changed that conversation a bit. But a lot of people. So my parents are a great index of how Bernie Sanders seems to the average American, I think, in some ways. So my dad just thinks he's a dangerous man and should probably be executed. I mean, just really a danger to the country. Because socialism has been so branded in America, it's so negative. People think socialism, they think gulags, and they think the people will come in and take my guns. I'm not sure how that's in the mix, but somehow it is. And so I think about my brother-in-law, for instance, who has said to me just the other day, and I love him, he's a great guy, but he said, think about all these Democrats, because he's kind of an independent voter, but he said, he's been entranced by Trump, because he said, think about all these Democrats is that they don't care about you. Only Trump cares about you. So I thought that was an interesting insight into what it is that Trump is bringing these people. The other people just care about issues, whereas Trump, who's a person, is an individual, and he's an individual for reasons that, frankly, are somewhat convincing. In other words, he doesn't hold to a particular, he contradicts himself. He doesn't hold to a particular political stance. He says what's on his mind. He's not politically correct. And these things translate to a lot of people as authenticity. And I do think that's true, but just authentic to what? So you see Trump speak, and you think, I think he is being authentic to what he believes, which is basically that the rich should be richer than they are. And I do think if you look at sort of Biden, for instance, you think he seems to be saying what he's supposed to say. So I do think that they are responding to something honest there. I do think there is a kind of authenticity there that isn't on the other side. So I get that. I just don't think the authenticity is the only measure of things. But that's a good question. Thanks. Yeah, Mary.
Hey Tom, so it's interesting about the how ingrained class is from a young age, like you absorb that, your family circumstances. Do you think that you can hand that down? Like you're from a working class background, but clearly you're not working class now in the sense of the money that you earn, you're an academic. Do your children, have they absorbed that working classness of you? Like, do they express that in some way? I'm very interested because my mother's family's working class, and my father's was half working class, half Greek middle class. But it's kind of, I feel like that has come down to me in a sort of middle class kind of family upbringing. I still absorbed that working classness, and
Absolutely.
and I think I've got these kids whose father was a lawyer and good money, but they've got this kind of working class feel about them that I can't kind of explain given their upbringing.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a weird
There's
thing.
no question about it. I mean, I think that, and that's a really good observation that you pass these things on unconsciously without meaning. And all the examples I can think of are from myself. So again, my partner was not working class, and so they're kind of a mix. So, but it's interesting too because our daughter, I was her primary caretaker, and she was a little bit at the beginning, formative years, a little more raised by me, and you could sort of see that imprint. Whereas my son was more raised, was almost completely raised by his mother. I mean, I was there, but I was pretty busy. So, and particularly his formative years, and you can really see that. And so she, she has a lot of, because she gets them from me, I can say this, bad habits, I think, and I think that they all pretty much come from me, and I think that they're working class habits. I think that, not being great with her money, although she's getting much better, just doing things like poor eating habits. My eating habits were atrocious as a kid. We used to go to McDonald's and all these sorts of things, and so I think some of that's been passed on. That kind of. So yeah, no, I think you do pass it on, even if you try hard not to.
Yeah, just hearing you talk, I've often pondered this. Like particularly my middle son, he's a working class Hutt Valley kind of guy. He's a builder too, and this is the way he reacts with friends and how he is in the world. He doesn't feel like what I think his upbringing kind of could have made him.
Yeah, well, that's that sense of having to feel for being in the game. That
Yeah.
that class means that you sort of belong to a group of people and fit in and seem to get how they interact
Yeah.
and talk. Yeah.
And isn't that just an indication of the social mobility we have in New Zealand?
Yeah, it may be. Usually when people think of social mobility, they don't think of moving down, they just think of moving up.
Yeah,
I don't know.
It's going down
in
and
both ways.
Yeah.
That you
Okay.
can choose your vicinity, you can choose your social strata.
Yeah, I mean, I have, yeah, I mean, I let's say this, I think I do know some people that have, be very careful, because probably all know the same people, that have been brought up in a very non-working class environment, that are in working class environments now, where they have said they don't really, there's always a part of them that feel like they don't fit in. There's always a part where they feel like, I'm not getting the game all the way, just something that I'm not quite understanding. But usually what theorists tell us, I don't have a lot of experience in this, that social mobility is just sort of, it works. So immobility works one way. In other words, everybody wants to get up. So that's kind of, you think about those things that you drive over with a car. You can definitely go one way, but you can't go the other. And so people want to go up in class, but people rarely want to go down. But there's very few blockers or obstacles to going down in class, particularly because when people do that, it's usually kind of a holiday, slumming it or something, or and so there's very few obstacles to that. And when you go down in class, you usually bring some money with you. So usually you're kind of welcome. If you want to come and slum it, and if you want to hang out with us, and you have more money, great, you can buy the drinks. And so I think there's not many obstacles to moving down in class. It's just when you want to move up, because then you want to take the resources that are up there, and that's never welcome. Yeah, great, good observations though. Yeah, anything else that was on your mind when you think about fiction in class?
I'm surprised to know that working class is dead.
Well, just the concept of class, theoretically, with theorists, people that write about sociologists mostly. And partly that's their own fault, because what they used to do, there was apparently, I'm not a sociologist, so I'm just reading about this, but what they used to do in the 80s and 90s is they used to take a look at a situation, instead of doing a more holistic analysis of, say, coal mining. Coal mining is a classic area that people are drawn to when they look at class, because it's geographically connected. People often do identify as a class. So what they did is they would say things like, okay, we're not going to consider gender, we're not going to consider their culture or racial backgrounds, we're just going to look at the numbers. And they would draw a line around these economic issues so much that it was not a very holistic picture that they would come up with in their analysis. And so part of what theorists were responding to was saying, and I think accurately, that's not really giving us much of a story. Just to tell us about how much people make and how much their parents made and how much their kids are likely to make. We don't know a lot of information though. That's not very fine grained. And so eventually people said, you know what, class analysis isn't useful anymore. It's not giving us. But now people are doing it different ways though too. People are doing more of a case study approach, where they're saying, well, actually, your amount of income and your income disparity, your children's income relative to yours, is part of a bigger picture. What is your cultural background? How does gender play into it? And so I think people are doing it a different way.
No more intersectionality.
Yeah.
Analysis.
But when class was announced as being dead, that wasn't happening. And I think it was a response to that, which was probably right. But like I said, it doesn't impact the lived experience of people who don't have enough. They don't care whether our class is dead. It's not dead in their lives.
No.
But often people aren't using that term, are
They're
they,
not,
working
yeah.
class? Like,
They're not.
they're uncomfortable using it and they don't quite know how. how it applies, I think, that's what I'm finding.
Yeah, and also too, people don't tend to think of themselves now in communities that are defined by economics in the way that they used to.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you find a resistance in this country coming to New Zealand? You initially did from the outside looking in. Do you find a resistance to class?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research on that too, and it's because there's this notion that New Zealand's a classless society, and I guess it depends on what you mean by class. So I think by one definition, maybe that might be true, but there certainly is income disparity.
But that's usually said by middle class people.
Mm.
If we don't talk about class in New Zealand because everyone assumes that it's all gone, and also because usually it's educated middle class people who we're talking about,
Yes.
and so that, to them it isn't there. But I think, well, from my observation and experience, if you're born into working class, that's how you remain in your ideas, and whatever happens to you, that is how it is.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and that's that notion of that sort of having a feel for the game, of that habitus, that somehow this is hardwired.
Is that still true though with the younger generation coming through? I mean, my kids are on their 20s. They've got quite a mix of friends of all occupations,
Yeah,
some of
that's
them
a good
unemployed,
question.
different, races and things. And I don't see that at all. No one would, I mean, I spent 20 years in England. People say proudly I'm working class.
Yeah.
I've never seen that here.
No,
All the young people.
people don't identify certainly
No.
in groups by class. But I do see that, when I look around, I live in Ashurst, I look around the village and I look around groups of people, particularly teens walking around, which they do a lot in large groups. It does seem to me, and I could be reading this cues wrong, that there are cues that they belong to the same class and that they seem to be congregating by class, and that's not exclusive. But I do think maybe it could be sort of a rural-urban divide as well. But I also think there's I'm not sure I have to do the statistics, but it seems like rurally there are people that belong to that make less money. There may be more of them. I don't know. That's a good question.
I work at a decile 8 school,
Okay.
whatever that means, and we have a huge diversity of class within our student body. We have students who are doing, a shift 4 nights a week, and then double shifts in the weekend, and they come to school looking really, really tired. And I say, well, do you need that extra part-time job? What's that for? She said, to get to university. Then we have those who are going to be fine because they're getting money from their grandparents or their parents, and their parents have invested in some kind of educational investment as they've grown older. And then we have others who are just really good at getting scholarships, a broad range of scholarships. And so, yeah, there's an incredible range within, and they all mix together in the classroom and outside. But you certainly hear certain attitudes coming out when they're talking, especially the seniors, when they're talking about what's happening next. And you get the bristling when somebody will say, I'm going to get this money when I leave and go and do university and be fine. And others who, are kind of shocked by that because they're working double shifts at things like whatever. But it
Is
really
that
affects their study.
sort of got something to do with race as well?
Partly, but not solely.
No.
Yeah.
But that's economics you're describing, rather than class particularly.
Yeah. Well, it's those who can rely on their parents and their inherited class, and those who can't.
With inherited money.
Yes.
It's just this term class that I find is quite interesting.
Yeah. But I think there's a massive shift in the last 35 years since, Rogernomics and their liberalism in having to pay fees at university. I was incredibly privileged to do my degree without any fees, and then my brother had to pay fees. It's just a massive shift.
But I think that's that thing of the class thing being a cultural thing in a sense, isn't it? Whether you're inheriting a whole lot of things in the sense of the identity of people based on obviously the financial side of things, but it's about how they've coped with that. That then that's what they're handing on, isn't it?
And how they define themselves,
Yeah.
even if unconsciously in relation to that.
And
I
a sense of
think-
entitlement that they take some of those who have them.
But isn't it the people who define themselves by class? You go, I'm working class, I am. You never hear someone say, hey, I'm middle class, I'm so proud of it. Or I'm one of the upper class ones. It's only the working class people who want to say, don't belittle me. This is who I am and I'm proud of it. And it's that kind of, it's almost an aggressive thing sometimes. We've known I'm working class. saying, you know, I'm better than you are because I've got where I am, even though I had poor parents. You know, it seems to be kind of a mark of pride to say you come from a working class background.
Yeah, I think it can be.
Well, it shouldn't be anything else, should it?
No, it shouldn't be anything else, but I find it interesting that, you know, we're talking about people, you can go up, but you can't go down. But a lot of people who might be middle class or have been well brought up with quite a lot of money will still claim working class roots, even though they don't have them particularly.
Right.
Almost if you're proud to be working class.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things about class is we tend to use it in two different ways, which is, or perhaps, I mean, when I think of it, first of all, it's what is the source of people's income? Is it labour or is it capital? So that's more of the sort of classic Marxist view of class, but it's tangled up, I think it's more used in terms of what is your social background, where, and I identify what you said about coming from a working class conservative background, which applies to one half of my family at least, where it's about like how much access to education have you had rather than do you earn a wage or do your parents like have lots of land or other sources of capital. And so the two are, I mean, you said before that, I think you said you weren't working class, but I mean, I'm going to pry into your income, but I mean, presumably your income is from earning a wage doing something, right? So but it's hopefully a wage that allows you to do things you'd like to do. So where am I going with this? We're going around the circle, but I'm just saying we're using it two different ways.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. And it's that. So in terms of income disparity, people are still talking about that, and that's the one aspect you talk about. But the other one, in terms of what are the social sort of markers and what are the social and cultural aspects of class, that's the kind of thing that often people used to identify as a sort of working term for a group of people that now, for various reasons, oftentimes people are not identifying with. So, yeah.
I think what I noticed being in Auckland, coming down to live down here, and particularly in Fielding, because I've lived in different towns, but specifically in Fielding, there is a class distinction in Fielding. And it's based on what I call daughters of the pioneers. There are actually, I mean, it's not a myth. There are actually people who assume a class identity based on how many generations since their ancestors arrived, and never mind what their ancestors actually did, but they're here, and it's given them a claim and a standing to, I mean, as an example, when I was working as a reporter, I went to interview someone, and she recognized that, or she realized she didn't know my surname. And she said, what's your background? And I was really taken back. I went, wow, that sums it up. You know, I just said, I don't have one.
Wrong answer, by the way, right?
I thought that was the best answer I could possibly get. But, and also the other thing about that is, coming from Auckland, being a bit of a melting pot, I think culture and ethnicity have a lot to do with it as well. And Mary mentioned Greek in your background, and coming from a mixed heritage myself, there are people who, no matter how many generations, 1, 2, 3, the original heritage is really important. And so you might be working class by economically, and in fact my father was very working class, but I was brought up to believe that we were somehow apart from the rest of New Zealanders, which is, an attitude like that is disadvantage, I tell you, which probably coloured my answer. I don't have a background, because you feel like some sort of mongrel dog, you know. But in actual fact, you're brought up to believe that because your family was from a certain place in Europe, that gave you a responsibility to behave and to have certain values. You had that responsibility because you had X number of thousand years behind you and that's a terrible thing to tell a child. But it does show that class does It's a factor beyond economics. It's like an intrinsic thing.
And put complex, yeah.
Thank you for that. It's just so interesting. You just set me off on all these trains of thought. I want to ask you a question that goes on to something different from class. But I just want to say thank you first because you've got me thinking about transition points. So in relation to this background question, I'm from Tasmania and most of the population there comes from convicts. And there was this whole, era where it was so shameful to admit you had a convict. And then there was this point in the 1980s where it completely flipped and it became social cachet to have a convict ancestor. And everybody was claiming one. And so, but then I was also thinking about the other kind of transition, which was, so my parents both came from impoverished backgrounds, but then my father did a very successful thing with a business which sort of rocketed us into middle class, but that happened over the course of my childhood. So I was just thinking about transition points, and there was this point where we went from having to shoot rabbits to eat to having a pet rabbit. And
that is a great marker, yeah.
Yeah, it was like this complete, so I just wanted to thank you so much for making me start to be able to see these things in terms of class and get a whole new way into trying to understand some of the really interesting transitions. Then I wanted to ask you a totally different question, which is, especially with writing about here, fielding when you live in the region, I really struggle with trying to write things that I want to write that are grounded in real places and people, because everybody's going to have so many opinions about that, and there may still be people alive who have their own family connections to that. And how are you managing that when you're writing about your own region and things that there probably are still people descended from roots or people who, in the transition of that religious group, they're in the ultimate current incarnation of that and have very strong beliefs about what happened and what it means. How do you deal with that?
Wow, okay, that's a great question. So just to give you an example that shows why I should be very concerned about this, after I published my first book, the main character in Stephen Bach's family is still very much alive in Gießen and are paying for a memorial plaque to be built for him, and very, very active in the community. They've been in the local legislature, and so quite an established family. And so a friend of mine who is in Germany, said that he'd given the novel to the family, and because we had talked about maybe I was going to be in Germany, and we talked about maybe I would come to the unveiling of the memorial. And I said, so how's that going? Were you on track? And he said, no, you better not come. So the family's really quite upset. They really don't like the novel. They don't like the portrayal of Stephen Bach, he said. Yeah. So that can be a real issue, and that was longer ago and further away than this historical fiction is set. So the likelihood of encountering someone who's going to have a connection to this material is high. So I guess partly my answer is I live in fear, and I hope they won't be armed. So I have been trying. I'm still researching, so I have been trying to ask around and see if anybody. The brethren are often quite close and aren't very interested in discussing things within my experience. So I am trying to, although I have some neighbors, so I have been trying to do some additional research and see if anybody's willing to talk to me, sort of on the record, if anybody thinks that there might be objections to some of these portrayals. And so I will factor that into things. So yeah, that is an issue. The other thing I'm thinking is that maybe not a lot of brethren will read my novel. So that's maybe good.
But what are you worried about? I mean, it's your novel. You could offend if you want to. I mean, are you worried that they'll find that you've got things wrong in the research, or are you worried about offending them? You'll always offend somebody when you write.
All those things. All those things. And just you worry about just getting the story wrong, really, more than anything else. But there's so little information known that I feel it's a little bit of a license. So I'm still looking for more, but I haven't found anything. So if you have any information, please pass it on. So part of the reason I'm going to some of the sessions tomorrow is to see there's a lot of, like Val Burr, who's a local historian. There's some people there that might have some information.
I love this idea of the rabbit.
a
Yeah.
you know, some, you know, one, so I'm just thinking about your novel, this connection between the two time periods, that the earlier ones are eating rabbits, and the later ones are looking after rabbits. I'm kind of thinking museum, you know, so somebody's looking after a museum, which is a recreation of the past.
Looking after the rabbit, but maybe deep down wanting to shoot it one day. You know what?
But I love it as a
Pissing you
that
off.
idea,
Yeah.
So you have a museum where you sort of recreate the past and trying to envision these people's lives and make them walk the talk again, so tourists can come and look at it. You know,
Yeah.
that's a rabbit you keep as a pet. Whereas the first people actually have that's a great
I
metaphor.
like that.
But it happened.
Yeah.
I didn't mean it to be a metaphor. It was just like something clicked when Tom was
Everyone
talking.
alive is a metaphor.
Well, that's great. No, I think that's wonderful. I think your notion of a museum is interesting because that is one way that we deal with the past.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We sort of we
You're
freeze it.
creating past lives, curating past lives.
Tina Makaneti's novel, Where the Lego Who Born Saints,
Yeah.
deals with those 3 time periods, and she connects them through Whakapapa,
Yeah.
but also the contemporary twins, that has what's her name, Lula, who ends up going to, she's the pale Māori, and she ends up going to London. I think she's in the British Museum and sees some Māori artifacts, and that's what kind of spurs her search for her identity. And so, yeah, I think that's such a powerful way of connecting 3 times.
And there are always little regional museums.
Oh,
aren't
there's
there?
some of them
Little
wonderful.
tiny, you know, kind of clutter places.
So there's one in Northbridge,
Yeah.
which has got a fantastic, 1870s again,
Okay.
early Norsewood arrivals. And it's beautiful, it's got diaries. It's actually got a house set up with Norwegian, you know, like a mock up an old ladies and they're doing music.
Have you seen the museum here, just across the road from our motel? There's a
No.
little,
Yes.
what's it called? I just saw it in the motel's brochure. And
Yeah.
it's something that's got carts in it and agricultural. Coach House Museum.
Yeah.
That might be
But
a
they're
good
often
source
run
for you.
by voluntary groups who are fascinating in themselves.
Yeah.
So the curation's a little oddball often. I'm not saying that one is.
No,
but
it is.
mine-
Which is perfect for a novelist.
You broke
Yeah.
my ops, Rachel's
And they'll have
curator.
like precious things in cupboards because they don't know they're precious and other crap out and dusty. Because my mother's involved with one
Oh,
around the
right.
committee and she's always upset by what she finds tucked away and goes, do you realise this is not a,
This is your
this
centerpiece.
is actually something that isn't. That's just someone's.
But you can find bits of your old mill that are sort of lying around.
Yeah.
And the old
Yeah.
rabbit traps will still be there.
And there are things in those museums they don't know what they're for, and they ask. They have like competitions. You know, who would have used this? And then
Yeah.
some old geezer comes and goes, my granddad. Yeah, it's
Well, these are great. Thank you for these ideas. This is what I was hoping. Like I said, I can see why it's useful for me.
I think the local
Very much.
iwi, the local iwi would know about the land, wouldn't they?
Ngāti kaupapa of the mana whenua, and yeah, I'm always interested as a Pākehā in the intersection of, you know, the first contact
Yeah, me too.
and like how land is being dispossessed, and you know, there'll be an underlying
think
story of that
the
for that
backstory
community.
there,
Yeah.
What were your brethren, were they directly from America or were they from Plymouth? Where did your brethren come
Yeah.
from?
From the UK, yes.
Because they were up Taranaki, most of them went up Taranaki, but did they?
Eventually, but they actually started off here. So many of the people that went to Norsewood started off here as well.
Yeah.
This was kind of because there was a sort of indentured servitude where you got part of your travel paid and your land paid, and then you reimbursed part but not all of it in your payments.
That was my people.
And that was in the Manawatu, and so it got a lot of people. Okay, yeah. They got a lot of people here, but then they often went other places. This was a really rough place, of course, to be because the bush here was so moist and so dense that people didn't. It was just hard work to be here. To clear a room this, land this size with just years of work, and people got frustrated and fed up and left. Sometimes they even went back to Norway, went back to Sweden. They just it was just too hard. And very little in the way of resources, very little. It's a very difficult place to pioneer. Yeah.
I was just thinking about, class and economic base. Of course, for iwi, the economic base was taken through colonisation. I was wondering if you're going to somehow acknowledge that in your novel, or how you're going to approach that underlying
That's a good question. I'll just have to put that in the mix.
Yeah.
Yes.
How do you research the sawmills?
Yeah.
I'm interested in the practical side of my farming and sawmills, and I've been interested in timber all my
Oh,
life.
okay.
I'm a worker,
Right.
and I like working with my hands, but gee, with a steam mill, it's an absolutely amazing thing.
It is.
Have you found any that are still?
Only on YouTube, but I would love to actually listen to one up and running. There's one in the US, but I'm getting there anytime soon. Yeah, great. Well, listen, thank you all so much for coming to the session. It was really great to chat with you, and I really appreciate your ideas and your questions and your input. And I feel like I've learned a tremendous amount, so thanks. Sorry if it's not cynical. Yeah, thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you around.
Beautiful writing.
Did you get into a singing competition? No, I gave him your name. Sorry, I don't mean. Nice to see you because you come back.
So Renee, she's a right now. It's a great thank you. It's really lovely. I like it. You've got someone else to talk about. Can you talk to me, Renee?
Oh yeah, and you kindly gave me permission for me to about the sea. My study.
Yep, that's my neighbor.
Yeah. I like that. I was just reading it the other day because we had to revise the study guide.
It's not
Trying
part
to
of
figure
that.
out how to do it. I think
He doesn't really want to hear about it too much, guys. Have news. Yeah. Well, I think
We had to
the
come
last.
out to do that. That's a nice area that was that would be
Yeah.
So I think he was up before we got on the list, you know, but I think he was kind of like that. So I think he pulled up his but he took it so much to heart. I mean, I just started, you know, just discussing it. Running this for hours and hours on end, he just the stuff was kind of filled up his whole mind. I mean, you know, this part.
Yeah.
Just roll right over it.
Oh, that's so well done, wasn't it, from the beginning?
So he stepped back. So
Oh, yes, you can talk about
So this, I was really happy to be invited back in 2015 at the time of change.
Lost on that movie already. We used to have, you know, certainly in our school and in humanities, there used to be a lot more international students. They've been gone for years now. So I feel like we lost that money already. We've been losing. I remember when I started, I had a very hard course about that maybe saw a couple next year, and then yeah, although actually, there's English because I don't know if
Don't mind.
yeah, I'm seeing. Thank you. So you a lot of experience with temporary.
We can get your hand with that too. Just horror writing
Now I caught up with her,
and so I'm sort of cheering it, so I'll sit there and then, like a half circle pretty much. I didn't see that one, but yeah, so if I'm cheering, I can sit to one end and then we'll see a circle the other foot.
so
But I was in a session doing yesterday. Asians were the whole mind in 2014. So many people there. These are people. There's coal mine so well, $100,000 a year, but they were still living in their original family homes. Really?
Yes, that's right.
So it feels quite, I mean, the big question is that at school was between the children and the children not. So I guess that's complex division. You get normal.
And then they
Are you
always
going
make
to
us
some other things today?
in school, we're always like one prize for a event.
Yeah, I need to have a look.
So did you as a private school?
Yeah.
Oh,
Very, very expensive. I don't know how that is.
Yes.
Yeah. But they did give us school shoes.
Yes.
Oh.
I'm gonna go, I know, a couple of people.
Oh, yes, you're going to that.
Yes.
Yeah, I might see.
That was
Oh, nice. That's right. That's right. I think it's about like we have during students. And one now, but that's the naughty teacher. And we planted orchids in stone, and naughty stone.
Between sessions when I go to the
Oh yeah, I just about to come over here.
Hey Tim, how are you?
Good, good.
Good for later? Yeah.
No, I think she got there since you're right.
Have you got a little thing you can read? Are you going to read some poems?
I was going to read some poems.
I think so, if you could.
Oh,
No, read from where we land. Yeah, that would be amazing.
yeah, well, I do.
I think because we've got it, it's an hour and 3 quarters long. I'm not sure we're going to go for the full
Yeah.
hour.
We do.
But we'll certainly talk, and there's enough of us, and then with a little reading.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll have a poem and a short.
Yeah, why not? That would
I
be.
think I want to go to, I know all of the people in this next
Oh yeah, there is a lot, and it's quite a slack on it, which is nice. And we always do KDK yesterday. Very interesting. And I'm also doing the horror writing room.
Yeah, I'll do
I'm
that.
gonna do that.
I mean, I've been listening, I was straight to listen to silence, but I probably heard quite a lot of it.
Oh yeah, I feel like I should see you here silent too. I'm glad you got up here, okay? I was thinking of you at 7 getting in the
No,
car.
that was fine.
Did he come and collect
He
you?
came and collected me.
Oh, nice.
It was about 5 minutes.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, and so
cool.
I'll get back with you.
Yes, we'll just jump in the car, like, we'll finish up here at 5
Yeah,
at our session, which is our sessions over in the other section at the back there. And we'll finish that at 5, and probably just chat with people, maybe if anyone buys the book, we'll sign it, and then we'll jump in the car and go.
sounds good. Yeah.
Sounds good?
And that, is it
Oh, no, Mike, no, he's around.
Oh, no, just say hi.
Yeah, he was on the Aiden Mara one.
Right.
And we're doing poetry, he and I doing poetry 1 at 1 o'clock here. So yeah, so it should work out well. There's cups of tea over here. It's at 12:30 and I've actually got a slot on my bag, so I'm just staying here. And there's places really by, there's just up the road, and then there's a few cafes in Nature Square, that's three and that, they're only
Nobody wants to.
no, no, there's my fear. See, he's all out there. He's a good Tom. Oh no, he's Tom. Blue, yeah, he's like coffee and
So I just want to say,
yeah, come and say hi.
Yeah.
Right, so it's a cup of tea I'm going to have, and then I'm going to go to Hollow Writing. I'll drop in on Simons as well. Simons is over there, I think. Oh, is that on there? Oh, so it's for you, like you care. I just
She starts out there.
see, that was great, really interesting talk. I didn't expect it to bring up all this stuff, but I've been worrying all the way through that. Yes. Looking at my bill or something. You may check.
How old is he?
So he's 20 something.
I didn't mean for it to be a trick.
I think he's 29. Isn't that terrible? He's 29. It didn't take long. I
Okay.
just,
No.
I'm just not focused.
No. Anyway. Hi. Yeah, unfortunately, I had to cancel that series.
Yeah.
This year, that library is this way we're willing to, so. So, what do you want?
So I've got lots of ideas. Just
Well, you know, I don't want to plug this, but our creative writing program, you get a lot of experience doing genres. And so that's kind of the strength you get to kind of learn. So, of course, I'm sorry, poetry course is not great enough. And then there's sort of writing, you travel a lot of other things that sort of feed into it. But yeah, so you kind of get it by the end of, or at least by the end of the year, you go, oh, it's not that. So are you that's great, thank you for coming. If you ever want to send me an email, if you want to chat about writing,
Hello. Hi. Oh, hi, good to meet you. Good. Yeah. Well, I've got some folks on the panel, so we're going to watch that and then I'll see this afternoon. I've got a few short stories. I've just had one accepted for an anthology called The Building Tomorrow, which is a sort of post-apocalyptic Australian-based anthology. I've got a fluffy novella, cosy, because a group of us we decided during lockdown we were going to write some optimistic, fun fiction. So we wrote these stories about witches. It was okay, it went okay, I think. I think it was the right thing to do. Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah. Okay, yeah, I think it's been such a great